We've been talking about gene disorders, and so now we're going to move on to talk about chromosomal disorders. Keep in mind, a gene was a section, whoops, having mistakes with the board here. Keep in mind that a gene is a section of DNA, or just part of a chromosome. And so when we talk about a chromosome, remember we're talking about something that looks like this. It's coiled up DNA. And so a gene disorder is when there's something wrong with just a small piece of the DNA. This is like a gene. But a chromosomal disorder, you also inherit, but it's due to a problem with the entire chromosome. It's caused by a mistake in meiosis. Remember, during meiosis, your chromosomes are supposed to separate so that you get half in each egg, or half in each sperm. But when we have a problem called non-disjunction, it's when the chromosomes don't separate properly. And so you see here this picture, where what should happen is they should double, and then they should divide, and then they should divide again, and you should have one in each of the eggs or sperm. But in non-disjunction, they don't divide properly. So here's where they didn't divide properly during meiosis 1, and here's where they wouldn't divide properly during meiosis 2. They can have mistakes either during meiosis 1 or during meiosis 2, and what it ends up with is something called aneuploidy. Remember, we know the prefix "u" means true. We know that the part of the word ploid means number of chromosomes. This sign meaning number of chromosomes. And "an" means not. So the word aneuploidy literally means not true number of chromosomes. So you have an incorrect number. You're either missing some or you have extra chromosomes. And what this means is that you have extra of many of your genes. So non-disjunction causes aneuploidy. That's something that we need to remember. The first disease or disorder that we're going to talk about is called Down syndrome. It's caused by having an extra chromosome number 21. So remember, you're supposed to have 46 chromosomes, 2 of each type. And so you can see that pretty clearly here in this picture. Now this picture is what's called a karyotype. So you have this picture of a karyotype in your notes. So let's call this a karyotype. And it's a picture of the chromosomes. And you're supposed to have 2 of each. 2 of number 1, 2 of number 2, 2 of number 3, 2 of number 4, 5, 6, 7. Sometimes they're kind of bent over. They have different banding patterns, but you're supposed to have 2 of each one. When we look here at number 21, we can see that this individual, whosever chromosomes these are, this individual has 3 number 21s. They do have 2 X's, so that means that this individual will be a female who has Down syndrome. Because of all of this extra DNA, they are going to have severe effects. They're going to usually have mental retardation, heart defects, an enlarged tongue, and lots of other symptoms from having this extra chromosome. So you do need to know the term Down syndrome. You do need to know that it's called trisomy 21, and tri because they have an extra chromosome. Tri meaning 3 when you're only supposed to have 2. The next example that we want to look at is called Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome has to do with the sex chromosomes. It's when you have an extra X chromosome, but you also have a Y chromosome. So you are XXY. And so one of the ways that I like to remember Klinefelter is I think of the word as being long. This is a pretty long word, Klinefelter. And XXY is kind of a long genotype. Remember, normal females are XX, normal males are XY. This individual is XXY. Now, having a Y makes you a guy. But they do have some of the female secondary sex characteristics, and they're usually sterile, meaning that they can't create viable sperm. They won't be able to produce offspring. You can use testosterone therapy to treat, but you can't cure it. And so this is what's called a sex chromosome abnormality. Turner syndrome is another sex chromosome abnormality. It's where you're female, but you only have one X chromosome and you're XO because you don't have a second example. You are female because you don't have a Y. Remember, having a Y makes you a guy. But you have underdeveloped sex organs and you're usually infertile. So those are the 3 chromosomal abnormalities that we need to know about. There are other examples of them, but you need to know Down syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, and Turner syndrome. The last part is, how would you know? How do you detect if you have a chromosomal disorder? One of them is a sonogram. It's the use of sound waves to produce a picture of a fetus. They can evaluate the baby's growth and development, and they can also do blood tests to screen for certain proteins. Remember, although we can identify if you have a chromosomal disorder, we can't actually cure the chromosomal disorder. We can also do what's called an amniocentesis. This is where they use the ultrasound to see where the baby is, and then they withdraw some of what's called the amniotic fluid. They insert a needle through the mother's abdomen and into the placenta, and they withdraw some of the fluid. That fluid will contain the baby's cells, and we can then use those cells to produce a karyotype. Remember, a karyotype is a picture of the chromosomes, and we can identify Down syndrome, Klinefelters, and Turners in that way. But you usually can't do this until about 14 weeks. So that's somewhere around 3 months. And that means that a lot of times that's really late in the pregnancy. If you want to do it earlier in the pregnancy, usually around 4 to 6 weeks, you can do something called chorionic villi sampling. It removes tissue from the placenta for karyotyping. But this is much riskier because you're actually inserting the needle up in through the woman's vagina, and you don't have as much control over where the baby is. So these are the ways that we can identify if you have a chromosomal disorder. Remember that chromosomes are your DNA, so are genes, so you can inherit those. Our last part of the notes is about what's called the nature versus nurture debate. What makes you who you are? Are you who you are because of the DNA you were born with? Or are you who you are because of the way you were raised and the experiences you've had? Nature is your heredity, your DNA. It's what you were born with. Nurture is your environment. It looks at your experiences. And so the debate is really around what has a bigger effect on you. Is what you're born with your nature, is your nature more impactful on you, or are your experiences more impactful on you? Most scientists will agree that it's actually a combination of the two for your overall self. However, certain traits are 100% genetic. If we look at things like Down syndrome, hemophilia, phenylketonuria, or PKU, those are 100% genetic. If we look at things such as tuberculosis, which is a bacteria infection, that's 100% environmental. But some things are right here kind of in the middle. They're partly impacted by your genes, partly impacted by your environment. One of the interesting things that we can do is use twins to study the effect of the environment, because remember, identical twins have the same exact DNA. They started as one egg and one sperm, and they are the same exact DNA, just in two different cells. And so especially if they were separated at birth and adopted separately, then we can really study the effect of the environment on them. So remember, things like diet in your environment can have a big effect, even on your genes. They can stop the progression of PKU, limit the risk of other genetic predispositions such as diabetes, heart disease, and certain cancers. Environmental toxins such as UV radiation or tobacco can even directly change our genes. And so what we see is that we have our genes, and we have things in the environment that influence our genes directly, things like UV radiation, which can cause mutations, and environmental impacts like your diet that can have an effect on how those genes are expressed or turned on. And so as we finish this unit, we really want to remember that you're born with certain genes, but your environment can really impact that as well. And that's the end. You do have a summary box there, so we're stopping the notes.